I do not go to see movies in the theater nearly as often as I would like to. However, last week I did happen to go see Man of Steel, and it sucked. Now, I'm not talking Transformers type suck. Nonetheless, it did suck. Now, I know this is going to be controversial, because some people, and I've seen reviews, so I'm not just saying this is hypothetical, I know this is the way certain people feel, we're like, what do you mean it sucked? It was like, blam, General Zod was like, blam, there's action, and everything exploded, boom, boom! This movie could have been directed by Michael Bay, however it wasn't, and apparently explosions and destruction are enough to sate the appetites of perhaps the average American, but I'm personally not one of those people. I'm pushing 30, 29 currently, and so maybe I'm just getting old and jaded and curmudgeon-y, maybe that's the case. I want to start this with a little segment I like to call Full Disclosure, in which I try and as best as possible to explain my bias of where I'm coming from. Now, I like Superman, but I'm not a massive Superman fan. I've read some Superman comics, and I've seen the original movies, you know, with Christopher Reeves. So I'm not the sort of person who's like, this is not a part of comic book continuity. I can't believe they did it that way. Because I've seen with plenty of comic book movies, there's a certain type of reviewer that just gets angry if it's not exactly like the comic. But I like Superman enough, well enough. I appreciate the original movies, even though they're very campy. Superman 2 is actually my favorite Superman movie, which is part of the reason going into Man of Steel that I had high hopes, at least when I heard about it, because they were including General Zod. And not only that Michael Shannon, who I think is brilliant, was going to be playing General Zod, and it had been decades since they had done a Superman origin story, so I thought, even though, yeah, here we go, another origin story, that enough time had passed that it wasn't that big of a deal. You know, it really is, at this point, introducing the character to a new generation. However, my roommate, who is a big comic book fan, big Superman fan, let's put it this way, his girlfriend threw him a Superman-themed birthday party for his most recent birthday. He went to see the movie, and he didn't like it, but he kind of understated how bad it was, because he said, well, he liked it better than Superman Returns. And I remember seeing Superman Returns in the theater, and my impression of it was not so much that I hated it, just that it was completely and utterly forgettable. It really just made no real impression on me. And so I thought, well, that wasn't a terrible movie, it was just forgettable, right? And in terms of Superman, if you want to read what, in my opinion, is my favorite Superman story, and again, I'm not a big expert in the Superman comics. Comic book-wise, I'm definitely more of a Vertigo fan. If you've ever read any Vertigo comics, it's an imprint of DC. Think The Invisibles, Y the Last Man, several other titles that are for mature readers. And at any rate, my favorite Superman comic that I've read, in terms of having a very interesting premise, is actually Red Sun, where it's a what-if Superman had landed in the Soviet Union instead of the United States. So instead of truth, justice in the American way, it's truth, justice in the Soviet way. And they find interesting ways of incorporating other DC characters like Batman and Green Lantern, and Lex Luthor is sort of the good guy in Red Sun. Very interesting story, of course. I'm sure other people would mention All-Star Superman, Birthright, things of that nature. Comic books, because they have different economics to them, can be more ambitious. And so comic books, in terms of visual art, are, in my opinion, the cutting edge of visual storytelling, whereas movies are all about trying to pander to a mass audience to make as much money as possible. So, why didn't I like Superman? First of all, I'll just summarize my 3 reasons. Number 1, it felt like every other blockbuster movie of the past decade. Number 2, massive, obnoxiously massive plot holes. And number 3, what I've heard other people describe as catastrophe porn, to the point where it's mind-numbing unless you have the mentality of a 14-year-old boy. in which case you will think it is the greatest thing ever. Pfft, Superman punch! So this video will contain spoilers, if you want to call them that, because that implies that there's something to spoil, which is debatable. The movie begins on Krypton. Surprise. And we see Jor-El trying to warn the High Council that Krypton's going to explode. Of course, they don't believe him. And we're also introduced to General Zod, who's fighting some sort of insurrection because he also believes the planet is in imminent danger. But, of course, in order to establish that he's evil, they must give him lines about genetic purity, you know, Nazi style, and tendencies towards fascism, and to put him at odds with Kal-El. Now, I think that General Zod's motivations are convoluted throughout the movie, and he's one of the main sources of plot holes in this movie. Now, in the original, not the original Superman movie, the original appearance in the movies of General Zod, Superman 2, they just made him evil. Now, one would think that, oh, come on, mustache-twirling evil, evil for evil's sake. No, we want psychologically complex evil, evil that has motivations. Well, turns out when you compare these two movies that sometimes that just doesn't work. So, I'll get back to that in a moment. Jor-El, Superman's father, realizing that the planet's about to explode, goes and steals the Codex of Krypton. What is the Codex of Krypton? Well, they have a Brave New World-like planet in which their entire society is genetically engineered. So they rely on this Codex, which contains the genetic templates for all the necessary social components, members of society of Krypton, imprinted on this skull thing. Now, you would think if their entire society depends on this genetic codex, that there would be perhaps more than one copy, that it would be guarded, perhaps. Well, if you think that way, then you're wrong. Apparently, they have no concept of guarding this all-important codex, or very little concept, as it were. So in a scene that is basically an Avatar meets Matrix ripoff, Kal-El goes and steals rather easily this all-important codex and imprints it onto baby Superman. General Zod tries to stop him because, you know, there's only one and only codex to fight over. It's not like this all-important thing would have backup copies, and it's not like it would be guarded. So the usual happens. Superman gets launched to Earth. General Zod gets arrested and sent to the Phantom Zone along with his minions, and Krypton blows up. And then we're treated to an extension of the first act. You know, pacing problems with this movie. The first act of this movie feels like it goes on forever and ever and ever. And essentially, in an attempt to create psychological realism for Superman, they want to establish that he has a dilemma of revealing his superhuman powers to humanity because Pa Kent down on the farm in Kansas convinced them that this was a really bad idea. And this, for me, shows that this incarnation of Superman has no spine and really cannot think for himself and is morally suspect. So he spends the first 33 years of his life, and that's one of the Jesus references to the movie. Everyone obviously gets the shot where it's him and then the Jesus stained glass behind him, but the age of 33 is also a Jesus reference, by the way. First 33 years of his life hiding his true superpowers because humanity won't accept him. Yet, he spends his whole life being bullied and outcast. You would think that by 33 he would have come to terms with the fact that haters gonna hate, okay? Not everyone's gonna like you either way. Look, Superman, what you should have done is save some kittens from trees, hired a PR firm, people would have loved you. Not everyone, but what are they gonna do? You're Superman. You're virtually invincible. If somebody gives you crap, just destroy them with your laser vision or something. It's not really that big of a deal that people are going to be afraid of you. I mean, what just get over it. And the fact that he could have, you know, done some actual good for humanity in all those years he was trying to come to terms with his superpower, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Not only is he spineless, but throughout this movie, in a way that subverts what we've come to know about Superman, I'll spare you reading the direct quote from Action Comics issue 1 describing Superman as the champion of the oppressed. Look it up yourself. But you don't really get a sense that this is Superman. For one thing, throughout the movie, civilian casualties? What civilian casualties? So, continuing on, the MacGuffin of the movie is that there is a Kryptonian spaceship buried under the ice in Canada, apparently, and so if naturally the US military's there, because in movies, Canada is America's doormat, and Lois Lane shows up, and that seems to be why they placed it in Canada, because by placing it in Canada but having the US military there, then Lois Lane can do some, you know, legal trickery and get to the site and be embedded with the military without getting as much crap. Right, and Clark Kent, aka Superman, is there as well, kind of undercover, and he goes in using his laser vision to bore through the ice to the Kryptonian ship. Now, this ship is apparently a scout ship / colony ship, and it has the same Matrix-like pods of creating a Kryptonian colony. And this is where the movie starts to make sense. In fact, pretty much everything having to do with the Kryptonian technology is a distraction from the plot and is incredibly convoluted and is largely the source of all the plot holes, but it's also the MacGuffin. So just try and ignore it. And for whatever reason, the ship was buried under the ice. So first of all, you have a scout ship / colony ship, and it can't even do what it's supposed to do. It seems like a great idea. You have this collection of, you know, embryo things waiting to be activated. That's a good way to solve long-distance space travel rather than, say, cryo sleep or something like that. You just wait till the ship has landed on the planet, and then you activate it. But here's the problem. You need the codex to start the colonization cycle, along with apparently a world generator engine. So this thing isn't self-activating, self-supporting. It just crashed and sat there waiting for actual people from Krypton to, I don't know, bring the one and only copy of their all-important codex to the colony planets. I think that humans could have come up with a better colonization of space system than these oh-so-great Kryptonians. But having activated the ship, he not only speaks with his father, who tells them that the Kryptonians once colonized space but then decided to abandon it, or at least that's the way they made it seem. You know, they colonized space but then they decided, colonization sucks, let's all go back to Krypton. It also alerts General Zod, who has for some reason been freed from this Phantom Zone by the destruction of Krypton. Now, General Zod, in his confrontation with Superman, explains that they went around to all the other colonized planets and everyone had died off because Krypton blew up. Okay, why? Why do you have these space colonies? First of all, I mean, you get the impression that the colonies were just abandoned to begin with, so you wouldn't think there were. But then that's contradicted, and he says, well, they were still there, but for whatever reason they weren't self-sustaining. They perished once Krypton did. Yeah, because that makes total sense. But in the process, they gather some technology, they get a world engine, which is a terraforming machine to turn other planets into a Krypton-like planet, and they head for Earth once they got the distress signal from the ship that Superman found. Now, this is where the movie starts to get stupid, because number one, it's established through expository dialogue at the beginning of the movie that is not merely the sun which gives Superman his powers, but also the atmosphere. This is reinforced by the fact that when Superman goes on the Kryptonian ship, he begins to lose his powers. Now, this creates a couple of different problems. One is the fact that General Zod and his minions seem to have all the same superpowers, and yet they're wearing respiratory breathing apparatus, which means that they're breathing Kryptonian-like atmosphere, not Earth atmosphere. So they still have all the same abilities and powers, but not because they're breathing the atmosphere, which is established that that is one of the sources of the superhuman powers. So they actually shouldn't have these powers, and when Superman is breathing the Kryptonian air, he loses his powers. But no. They get all the powers and still breathe the Kryptonian air, apparently. Now, General Zod, rather than just being like, hey, I have superpowers, I'm going to make everyone kneel before Zod and rule this Earth planet like he was in Superman 2, no, he has a much more convoluted scheme. So General Zod, of course, wants to use the world engine to terraform Earth to be like Krypton. And this is the movie's main plot hole, because if you're writing a script and there's some obvious solution to a dilemma and the character doesn't take it, the audience is going to be like, hey, wait, why didn't they do this? And the problem is that this world engine, as far as the plot establishes, could make any world into being like Krypton. So why Earth? Why an inhabited planet? Superman, moreover, had what negotiators call leverage. He had the Codex inside of him. So what Superman should have done was be like, look, General Zod, you want a new Krypton, I don't want humanity to die, so how about you take your world engine over to Mars, because I mean, fuck Martians anyway, and you can make Krypton over there. I'll, let you use the Codex in exchange, and everybody wins. It's a win-win situation. But nope! We gotta make Earth into Krypton. But this further makes no sense, because, as I've already explained, it's established that it's Earth and its atmosphere and its sun that gives the Kryptonians their superpowers. And by turning the planet into Krypton, they would be going back to not having superpowers. Kind of a dumb exchange, if you ask me. Having a planet like your old planet versus having superpowers. Now, this leads to the next, not only poorly explained but outright contradicted facet of this movie, which is General Zod's motivation for not wanting superpowers, essentially. Because the initial disorientation caused by trying to acclimate themselves to Earth's atmosphere is bothersome, he says that he does not want to do that because why spend years of pain when we can just have a new Krypton now? I think, first of all, I think a few years of discomfort in getting oriented to your new atmosphere is a fair exchange for, being able to fly, having laser vision, super hearing, super speed, all these other superpowers. Yeah, I think a little pain and discomfort might be worth it. That seems like a fairly reasonable trade-off to me. And hey, even this dumb farm boy was able to do it, so how hard can it be? Which leads me to the fact that this explanation was contradicted, because after General Zod's respirator Kryptonian mask thing was destroyed, in which case he shouldn't have had the superpowers while wearing it. As I've already explained, it was established that Superman lost his superpowers when he was exposed to the Kryptonian atmosphere, but it apparently doesn't work vice versa. So General Zod says, I have complete control of my senses because I was trained from birth to be a military soldier and you're just some farm boy. So all this crap about what an inconvenience it would be to have to adapt to Earth's atmosphere is completely contradicted by the fact that he's just like, I'm a soldier, I got this in 2 seconds. And it's pretty clear that within minutes he has adapted to the Earth's atmosphere with few tangible problems. And this, again, even though it's cartoonish to have a villain that's just like, I'm evil, I want to rule the world, kneel before Zod, cartoonish, but once you try and get into convoluted explanations of why evil is evil, often it falls apart, and it completely falls apart in this movie. There's no real reason why General Zod should be attacking Earth. He's only making more problems for himself by turning Superman into the enemy. He's sacrificing superpowers to have an atmosphere more like Krypton. He could have just gone and terraformed Mars and everybody wins, but no. And so, getting into the whole scheme, he launches this world engine on one side of the planet, and of course it requires this other ship on the other side of the planet, even though that was never quite established when they first introduced the world engine. Just don't think about any of this too hard, okay? It's my advice for this movie. Just don't think about it. And of course they have to settle above Metropolis. Why? Because it's a movie. And that's when we really get into the catastrophe porn, as some people have aptly named it. This movie depicts 9/11 times 1,000, as I think was the line from South Park. And we see large parts of Metropolis being utterly destroyed. And just like the earlier fight scene in the movie with Farmville, sorry, Smallville, you could call it Farmville. At any rate, there is a complete and utter disregard for civilians and human casualties in this movie, which in my opinion really undermines the entire spirit of Superman. Not only does Superman seem indifferent to these masses of civilians being killed around him, unlike in Superman 2, where Superman deliberately leaves Metropolis to get General Zod and his other soldiers to follow him to spare other civilians being killed. Superman in this movie just doesn't seem to care. Not only that, but in the fight scene in Smallville, the military doesn't seem to care either. They carry out airstrikes with A-10s and other military aircraft on this town in Kansas. Now, if drone strikes are any indication, then clearly the military doesn't care that much about civilian casualties if it's in, you know, Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or somewhere other than America. That's tribalism. You know, there's us and there's them. Every human group is, to one extent or another, tribalistic, and things are shoved under the rug. But the military would just seemingly take it upon themselves to perform airstrikes in the middle of Kansas without even like consulting the president, like hey, Mr. President, is it cool if we, you know, have some A-10s do airstrikes in the middle of Kansas amongst American civilians? They didn't even bother to consult the president on this. They just start attacking, and throughout the movie the civilians are just in the background, the bystanders, but you just kind of forget about them. There's no concern in the focus of the movie, in any of the actions of the characters, that, hey, wait a minute, civilians might be being killed right and left. And the military just seems to attack Kansas indiscriminately. In the Metropolis fight scene, this is taken to 11, as they say, and which we see massive parts of Metropolis just completely destroyed. Thousands of people, maybe even tens of thousands of people, must have been killed in this scene, but the movie does not want you to even think about that. And Superman, who is supposed to be the champion of humanity, doesn't even seem to regard it. It's like, oh, there's buildings falling everywhere, destruction all about me. Oh, who cares? There's no concern whatsoever for civilian casualties in this movie, and that seems to utterly go against the Superman ethos, in my opinion. Let me backtrack for a second and say that this world engine Superman destroys that with a single punch. Now, General Zod had several minions. He could have had one of his minions go and guard the World Engine to make it at least a little bit more difficult for Superman to destroy it, but nope, it's left completely undefended for absolutely no reason, destroys it with one super punch. Bam, that's the end of the story of that, and then he flies back around to the other side of the world, the Metropolis, to fight the rest of them. And then, how do you get rid of General Zod's ship and General Zod's minions? With a completely inexplicable use of the Phantom Drive. You see, Superman's ship that he came to Earth in, it has a Phantom Drive. Their ship has a Phantom Drive. So apparently if you collide these two ships together, they'll magically create a black hole which will only destroy the two ships and suck them into the Phantom Zone, leaving everything else around it unaffected, even though it's generating a black hole. And don't try and think about this. Do not try and think about how this is supposed to work. Two ships go bang, ships disappear, General Zod's minions and ship gone. That's all you're supposed to know, okay? Just do not think about it. And so, of course, this just enrages General Zod. Big fight scene, straight out of the Matrix. And I want to say again, one of my primary problems with this movie is that it just feels like a ripoff of every other major blockbuster movie of the past decade. I don't mean some sort of postmodern homage and clever reference to these things. It's just, it feels like the ultimate reiteration of every other blockbuster movie. So there's the Neo versus Smith, Superman versus General Zod fight scene in this movie with everything getting knocked down all around them. Don't think about the civilians. Oh, there's Perry White trying to save a secretary from some rubble, and they never really establish any sort of emotional connection or any substantial connection, attachment of the audience to Metropolis as a city. It's just there to be destroyed as a set piece, like something out of a Godzilla movie, and it all feels hollow, and it's all so over the top that it becomes mind-numbing. And of course, some people, it's catastrophe porn to them. Yeah, this is awesome. Everything's exploding, boom, bang. And it's done to the point where it just feels completely hollow. There's no pathos to it. You don't get any sort of emotional reaction to it. It's just things happening. And it's not quite as what the hell's going on as, say, Transformers, but nonetheless, it seems just indiscriminate with no real impact on you. And so, of course, in one of the most cliche scenes ever, General Zod's gonna kill some poor hapless civilians with his laser vision, and all of a sudden Superman snaps out of it after you know, thousands of people have died all around him, and he shows no particular concern. Suddenly he's got to save this poor family cornered by General Zod's heat rays, and so he snaps General Zod's neck to kill him. And thus ended a completely hollow movie. So then, in an apparent homage to the Superman mythos, Clark Kent goes to work for the Daily Planet, but they had to throw in a line that by working for a newspaper that it would bring him closer to the action and he would know what's going on. Now that might have been a great explanation circa 1938. However, we live in the age of Twitter, in which you would probably be much more informed and up to the minute of what's going on, if only in a narrow sense, by checking a Twitter feed than going to work for a newspaper, which has at any rate, this movie sucked, okay? And I know there's going to be a lot of people who are like, oh, it's awesome, and the action, and da-da-da. I guess it has to do with maturity level, and if you actually want the story to make sense, and you want things to have an impact on you, instead of just being, as Shakespeare put it, sound and fury signifying nothing, then you probably won't like this movie. However, plenty of good Superman stories to read in the comics. Hell, even the original Christopher Reeves movies are better. Go watch those. Go watch Superman 2 instead. That's still, Superman 2, after all these years, is still a better movie than the Man of Steel. That ends an incredibly long rant on Man of Steel. It sucked. Goodbye.